we observe good-looking parents produce typically good-looking kids. And because of the parents good-looking, they make more money. And because the kids get those looks, they too make more money. We know that rich parents produce rich kids. A small part of that is due to the transmission of beauty across generations. So if you have good-looking parents, you got to step up in life already, both because the parents make more money, which they give to you, and because you get their good looks, and that enables you to make more money.
I got my hair cut this morning. I have, I think, a dashing, maybe even rakish amount of stubble. How hot am I?
I'm very loath ever to rate people's looks publicly, okay? For several reasons. One, it would get me in trouble, especially if I rated women, which I do mentally, but never out loud. And B, my opinion is just one of many people's opinions of your looks or anybody's looks. And my guess is I'm a normal person, so I get it on average right, but there's a lot of variability. People agree, but not perfectly. So I don't know what you wrote. Anyone from one extremely bad looking to five absolutely drop dead gorgeous. You're somewhere between there, somewhere 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1.
But you have rated me before, so I know what you think of me. I am a mediocre 3, even with my new haircut.
One doesn't know with stubble. I mean, my wife thinks if I had stubble instead of this gray beard, I would look much hotter, but I don't.
Why does this look? I mean, you have perfectly encapsulated the social awkwardness of this. You don't like rating people. It feels weird for me to say how ugly or attractive am I, but you admitted that this is something that you do in your head all the time, and I think people watching this would do it in their head all the time as well. Why does this matter? And how much better would my career, life, everything be if I was a 5 rather than a 3?
Okay. Again, first of all, let me just qualify it by saying I never talk about how much better off an individual would be if he or she were really gorgeous instead of average. Okay. On the other hand, typical economist line, on the other hand, we know that those who are a 5 or even above average compared to the average people will make more money over their lifetime. They'll be treated better. They'll get ahead a bit better. Every dimension of their lives, they'll do better. So yes, it matters. The issue is, and this is where my research began 30 some years ago, is how much better, trying to measure how much better in different dimensions.
And how did this begin for you? How did you become the economist who's the beauty economist?
The pulchronomist is the term, actually.
Pulchronomist.
Yes, how did I become the pulchronomist? I just happened to see some numbers on something else I was working on in which individuals' looks had been rated as part of the survey. And I said, wouldn't it be fun to look at what the impact of those ratings are and how well they do financially in terms of their earnings per hour or per week?
And I mean, look, this is an area of research that lots of people have got into. We have a surprising amount of data sets, I think, where it turns out that people have been or can be rated for attractiveness. And I think we should say, and you mentioned this earlier, we're always talking about population averages. We're not talking about one individual's trajectory. But can you give us an idea, where is the consensus? How much does being attractive change your earnings, for the simplest one?
Sure. But it depends, of course, the country you're in. It matters more in the U.S., not because we're hung up on beauty, or we may well be, but rather that everything that differs across people has a different and larger impact on earnings because inequality is somewhat greater here than in most other Western countries. In the U.S., I'd say going from the middle half to the top third would get you maybe 4 or 5% more. Going from the middle half to the bottom sixth would probably cost you 5 to 10%. The real thing is the penalty for being bad looking, not the premium for being good looking. There's an asymmetry there.
I mean, it may seem an obvious question. I don't think it is an obvious question. Why?
That is a very tough question. We economists are great at measuring, at accounting. Let's not kid ourselves, at accounting. But talking about the why of things, very hard to do that without an experiment. And sadly, there's no experiment we can run which would make Tom Whipple really good looking, gorgeous, and see how much better he does. We can't do experiments like that. A, physically, technologically. B, there are probably ethical issues involved too. So it's very hard to say why. standard line in the old days was this really mattered for your how attractive you were for reproductive purposes. If you're good looking, you're probably healthy, sort of like the large lion out in the jungle who looks smooth, clean, and gorgeous, and all the lady lions are hot for him. But you're just as reproductively likely to be successful these days if you're bad looking or good looking. So this is something left over from the days when beauty really was an indicator of health rather than just something which happens to be there as it is today in most countries.
Going through some of the studies that into the effects of this, it seems to get into almost every aspect of life and death. One of the more interesting studies I saw recently was about how people on death row or people are more likely to be given a capital conviction and executed if they look more like a wrong 'un than if they are clean cut but have also committed murder. You're more likely to win elections if it's a head-to-head. I think certainly if they're essentially unknown candidates, if it's a head-to-head, you're more likely to win elections if you're the more attractive candidate. What else have we got? What are your sort of favourites?
My favorites, well, let's think. There's so many studies in so many areas in which this has been shown to matter. National Football League. This is the major weekend in American football. Uh, those who are quarterbacks, that's the team leader, who are better looking, make more money and lead to more success in the team. And you can think of some examples like that. Army generals who are better looking advance faster through the general staff ranks. Okay, there's an old study on that. In my own stuff, people who are better looking live substantially longer. I mean, for women, we're talking a couple of years longer life expectancy, which is a substantial amount. Somewhat less for men, but still an extra year for men too. That's a recent study of mine. I think that's important because people living longer, assuming they're equally healthy, are having a lot better life than those who don't live very long. But there's so
Yeah.
many different areas in which have been shown over the last 20, 30 years to matter.
And one of the things that I find interesting that you mentioned the NFL and the Generals study is that to an extent, and I think we should get into the attribution of prejudice to this and later, but to an extent, this might be a reflection of prejudice, but it could also be rational because if you're a team leader and people who are prejudiced pay more attention to you and are more willing to follow you into battle because you're attractive, then this is a logical person to promote.
It's a very rational. It's also similar and a much more mundane analogy is those professors who are better looking appear to get better attendance. And maybe the students are just there to enjoy my good looks when I'm teaching, but one also thinks they might think that I know more, and there is evidence that looks matter for student-teacher evaluations more the lower the level of the class. And if I'm good looking and teaching a fancy class, the kids can tell that I'm an idiot and don't know anything. But at a lower level, they don't know whether I know anything or not, and they'll pay more attention to me, attend class more, and maybe, God willing, actually learn something more because of my good looks. That's the hope. Exactly analogous to following the general into battle.
Can we talk a little bit about there's one study in the UK that's one of the ones that's provided a lot of this data. Can you talk me through this study and quite why it is that there are probably a whole bunch of people listening to this who it turns out were rated for hotness by their primary school teacher?
Yes, I don't know how many more recent cohorts, but in the so-called 50s cohort, I think born in 1958 maybe, 1 week, anybody born in the first week of March, I believe it's 58 in the UK, a large fraction of them were included in the study, and they know themselves. They've been followed every 7 or 8 years by it. And at ages 7 in primary school and 11, which I think is still primary school in the UK, their teachers were asked to rate their looks, not on a scale 5 to 1, but were they scruffy, unkempt, okay, or good looking, okay? And half the kids were rated very well, but there was a third or so who were rated so-so, and about 10% rated pretty badly. And it works out gorgeously. These people over their lives, their ratings as kids at age 7 and 11 is related to how much they earned later in life at age 30, 40, 50, etc. Amazing
Yeah.
how little it changes.
And you also found that it relates to where they end up physically as well as economically.
Yeah, I can mention two pieces of work I've done on that. Let's use the less bothersome for your audience one. In the state of Wisconsin, people who graduated secondary school at age 18 in 1957, those who were better looking were less likely to remain in Wisconsin the rest of their lives. So you looked at them at age, I think, well, in their early 60s. Similarly, and I guess that just get me in trouble in your audience, is that in the UK, those who were good looking but born in Scotland or went to primary school in Scotland or Wales were more likely to leave Scotland and move to Southeast England. Obversely, those who were bad looking who grew up in Southeast England were more likely to get out. Not huge effects. I mean, there's not this mass exodus of ugly people headed up the M4. I don't think that's not happening. But there is some movement in that direction, yes.
Oh, can I commend you on your knowledge of UK motorways? It is good as a southeast of England resident. It's good to know that we have a filtration process for.
No,
for
no, it's very bad for you, actually. If I were a good looking Southeast England resident, I'd be upset about the influx of hot people from elsewhere competing with me for jobs. No, you don't want to say that.
No, you're absolutely right. Let's look. This I think probably is a good juncture to get onto the morality of this. If we had, if we had been talking about something else, if you had said, and people with this characteristic earn X percent more, those with this characteristic earn X percent less. If it was race, if it was disability, if it was gender, we would be doing something about it, or we would be probably not sitting here chuckling. I wouldn't have sat here and, made jokes about ugly filters and things like that, because it wouldn't be something that I would find funny or that it would be socially acceptable to find funny. How do we deal with the fact that attractiveness feels like it's in the same category of prejudice, but isn't treated as such?
Well, first of all, I disagree with your premise. Since January 20th last month, people would feel perfectly happy since we have an example of it in the White House making comments just like that. So I think you're quite wrong. But let's assume in a rational world in most countries that you're correct, okay? In that case, yes, logically, there's very little difference between race and looks. It's very hard to change race. It's very hard to change your looks. So logically, they're quite analogous, and the impact's probably larger for race, much more difficult. It's just we care more about that, and we should care more about that, especially in the United States, where race has been perhaps the primary issue in the history of the Republic, but elsewhere also. But to me, logically, morally, I see no reason to treat one different from the other in terms of not making fun of it, not joking about it, etc., etc. So yes, they're the same thing.
But we don't have a Martin Luther King of ugliness who says, "I wish my ugly children to live side by side and be judged on the content of their character." We don't have laws on ugliness. We don't have interventions. There aren't HR departments which are trying to, it's not diversity, equity, inclusion, and ugliness. Is it something that we could introduce in that way and formalise, or is it just something we have to accept about ourselves? And if the latter, isn't that depressing?
First of all, yes, we could introduce such things. Obviously, I mean, if there's a sufficient payoff to me telling people I'm ugly and been discriminated against, I'd be happy to claim ugliness. I mean, the money would be very attractive. The thing is, should we do this? I mean, look, given the unwillingness, at least in this country, to do very much about race or minority status, especially these days, do you want to spend what little political capital we have worrying about something else, namely bad looks? I don't, but that's a political decision. Morally, logically, I see little difference. Should we worry about it? Yes. Should we try to behave better? Of course, yes. Should looks matter? No, in most cases. I don't see why, if I'm an NFL running back, let's take an example, I should pay more attention. I shouldn't pay more attention to the quarterback who's good looking because he may be a stupid signal caller and get me matched by the other team. But right now we do behave that way, and it's just unfortunate in my view.
One of the research areas and I guess paradigms that did the most for me to explain what might be going on is the I think it's called "What is beautiful is good." This idea, which we see in everything from fairy tales to singers in celebrity singing competitions. Could you talk me through what it is and what it means?
So you're talking about the Susan Boyle counterexample, eh?
I guess so.
But what it means is that somehow we have this notion, for reasons going back to the jungle, to our running around before modern civilization, that somehow if you're good looking, you'll be good at doing things, you're a better person, less likely to commit crime, etc. Which in fact happens to be true. But is it true inherently, or is it true because of our attitudes cause people to behave that way? Okay. Regardless, in my view, I do hope that at some point this will disappear. That is, people realize that this is behavior left over from a period where beauty might have mattered for reproductive reasons, but surely shouldn't matter for that. Doesn't matter for that now. We shouldn't let it bother us. The same thing with race
Yeah.
or gender. I mean, someday, but that day is not going to be in my lifetime, maybe in yours.
Yeah. And we should say, so, I mean, you mentioned Susan Boyle, and it feels like the classic example. She was on a singing competition, and she turned
Right.
up looking, a normal, middle-aged, perhaps slightly frumpy woman. And the audience knew what to expect because the format of these shows is in the early rounds, you have people who are hopeless. And if ever there was a deluded, hopeless candidate, it was clearly Susan Boyle. Who was this woman who was going to assault our eardrums for the next 5 minutes? But the producers obviously knew what was actually the case, which was she had an astonishing voice. And the effect she had was what is beautiful is good. It was this dissonance in our head that
Right.
someone who didn't look beautiful, and she didn't, could sound so astonishingly beautiful. And I guess what I found fascinating about that wasn't the singing, wasn't the immediate thing. It was that what came afterwards. It was that we almost congratulated ourselves as a nation that we weren't shallow, and we bought her albums in their millions, and she became a global celebrity and a face for sort of looks are only skin deep, but almost her success. I don't know what you think. Her success was a validation of looks that only skin deep because it was precisely in the contradiction of that paradigm that she gained her ability to do so well.
I agree, and I think we felt good about ourselves that we could overcome that prejudice. But nonetheless, in most cases, we don't overcome that prejudice because we don't see something else that the person does extremely well to contradict our feeling about their looks, which is quite negative. This happens, certainly. I mean, I look at opera singers, a lot of whom are not that dissimilar from Susan Boyle, and we don't pay attention to their looks. We value something else. But in most cases, regrettably, we still pay attention to looks. Economics professoring, for example. I mean, I told the dean of my university that if I were good looking, I'd get on a 5-to-1 scale. I'd be getting a 6 rating from my students. But I don't, sadly enough.
But you unusually had the peer-reviewed research to back up your claim.
Oh yeah, the dean wasn't impressed despite that, despite being a very good scholar. I just published a paper in a leading science journal looking at the impact of my parents' looks on my looks. Okay, not in my case, but generally with a large set of data, and asking to what extent inequality across generations is due to the transmission of beauty across generations. Look at Beckham and whatever her name is, Posh Spice. I mean, they're both just incredibly good looking, right? And their kids are also above average looking. Take a look at them sometime. This is a standard thing that we observe. Good looking parents produce typically good looking kids. And because of the parents good looking, they make more money. And because the kids get those looks, they too make more money. We know that rich parents produce rich kids. A small part of that is due to the transmission of beauty across generations. So if you have good looking parents, you got to step up in life already, both because the parents make more money, which they give to you, and because you get their good looks, and that enables you to make more money. In other words, the problem is persistent across generations.